Is this dream a meaningful, heroic journey into the depths of the unconscious to heal a broken heart, or merely the meaningless, random misfires of a stressed brain trying to synthesize an illusion of control? Welcome to the debate on the ASM channel. This content is prepared under the supervision of Arven.
It really is the crux of the whole field, isn't it? I mean, we are looking at a clinical case study today that reads like, like a surrealist novel.
Oh, absolutely.
But the implications of how we interpret it are just massive.
Right, it surely is a fascinating sequence. For those catching up with the material, we are examining a highly complex dream from a clinical subject, and it is completely steeped in the agonizing reality of unrequited love.
Yeah, the narrative is incredibly vivid.
It is. So a man illegally crosses a border river, essentially smuggling himself into England to reach a girl he loves. And along the way, his best friend boldly approaches this same girl and kisses her on the cheek.
Which is quite the inciting incident.
Very. And in response, the dreamer violently punches his friend in the face.
And it doesn't stop there either. Right after the punch, he finds the girl, but she is deliberately pretending to be asleep.
Right, she's totally shutting him out.
So frustrated, he resorts to tickling her to force some kind of physical reaction.
Which is just painfully awkward.
Highly awkward. And then the narrative just abruptly jumps. It concludes with the two of them sitting perfectly happily on the edge of a steep cliff, laughing together as if, none of the previous tension ever happened.
It's a wild ride. And our central question today is how we categorize this bizarre nocturnal sequence. Now, looking at this through a psychoanalytic lens, it looks like a masterpiece of survival. I mean, I see this dream as an engineered psychological narrative.
Engineered?
Yes, meticulously designed by the unconscious to process profound emotional trauma. It's drawing heavily on the traditions of Freud and Jung, acting as a purposeful mechanism for compensation.
I hear that, but as a neurobiologist, I have to look at the hardware. I come at it from a different way entirely. I completely reject any hidden meaning or coded messages or purposeful design in the sequence.
No purpose at all?
None. I look at this through the neurobiological activation synthesis theory. In my view, this dream is a physiological byproduct. It is literally the biological noise of a stressed nervous system, utterly devoid of deep metaphorical warnings.
Well, I see why you might think that, but let me give you a different perspective, starting with the sheer intentionality of the dream's architecture. From a meaning-making standpoint, the unconscious isn't just generating static. It's a master architect.
Okay, but
just hear me out. The dreamer's ego has failed to attain the object of desire in waking life. The mind is wounded, so the dream acts as an active compensation mechanism. It is patching its wounds to prevent a total mental collapse in waking reality.
But see, you are overlaying a highly literary, almost theatrical framework onto what is essentially an electrochemical glitch.
A glitch?
Yes. If we look at Hobson and McCarley's activation synthesis theory, the foundation is incredibly clear. Dreaming is merely the product of random electrical firings in the brainstem, specifically the pons during REM sleep. It's firing acetylcholine wildly.
But how does random firing create such a cohesive, emotionally resonant story? I mean, it flows.
Because the forebrain is a narrative-generating machine. Look, the subject is suffering from exceptionally high emotional stress in his waking life, right? His brain is saturated with cortisol and adrenaline.
Sure.
So when those random signals fire from the brainstem, the forebrain desperately attempts to string them together. It grabs the thought of borders, a memory of a trip to England, the face of an old friend, and tries to force them into a somewhat linear narrative. The brain is working with static. It's trying to draw a constellation out of random stars.
I'm just not convinced by that line of reasoning, because the specific actions taking place in this dream are just too precise to be mere static. Let's look at the physical altercations, what we might call the punch and the tickle.
Okay.
In the dream, the friend kisses the girl, and the dreamer's immediate reaction is to violently punch him.
Right, a sudden, jarring burst of violence.
Exactly. But from an analytical standpoint, this friend isn't just a randomly generated character. He represents what Carl Jung called the shadow.
Here we go with the Jungian archetypes.
It fits perfectly. For those who aren't familiar, the shadow is essentially the psychological basement where we lock away the parts of ourselves we don't want to admit exist. In this case, it's the bold, masculine, perhaps transgressive part of the dreamer that he is too terrified to express in his waking life.
Because he is paralyzed by his reverence for this girl in reality?
Precisely. He can't make a move, so his unconscious projects that repressed boldness onto the avatar of his friend. When the shadow actually takes action and kisses her, the dreamer's ego violently represses it with a physical blow. He isn't hitting an external rival. He is punishing his own repressed desires. It is a brilliant internal psychological conflict playing out visually.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that. Let me tell you why. You are giving the sleeping brain entirely too much credit for metaphorical genius. What is actually happening is far more mechanical.
More mechanical than punishing your own desires?
Much more. The brain in REM sleep is activating separate memory circuits simultaneously. We have a circuit for a friend, a circuit for a girl, and a deeply ingrained circuit for feelings of inadequacy and waking frustration.
So you're saying it's just a traffic jam of memories?
Yes, exactly. Think of the forebrain as a desperate late-night film editor who has been handed a pile of completely unrelated B-roll footage and told to make a movie in 5 minutes. The punch isn't a profound, symbolic rejection of the Jungian shadow. It is just the forebrain resolving a spatial and narrative conflict.
I have to admit, when you say it's just a spatial conflict, you lose me a bit. How does the brain just randomly conjure a fist fight out of a spatial error?
Because the dreamer's motor cortex is locked down in sleep paralysis, the brain is generating avatars, the friend, the girl, the dreamer, and suddenly they're overlapping in the same generated scene. The sleeping brain has poor spatial coherence.
Right.
So to make sense of the sudden overlap of these neural representations and to process the intense background static of waking emotional frustration, it introduces a physical conflict. A punch is a very simple, deeply primal neural pathway. It resolves the scene.
Okay, but what about the tickling? Immediately after the punch, the dreamer resorts to tickling the girl while she pretends to sleep. Psychoanalytically, this is a classic Freudian displacement of sexual desire.
Displacement.
Yes, when a person is unable to establish a mature, mutual emotional connection, the psyche regresses. Tickling is a childhood mechanism. He is attempting to force a physical, involuntary reaction from someone who is entirely emotionally unavailable to him in reality. It's a perfectly engineered scenario to extract the interaction he is denied.
Again, it's a brilliant narrative, but neurologically, it's the exact same spatial mapping mechanism as the punch.
Really? Just spatial mapping again?
Yeah, what's happening is that the somatosensory cortex, the part of the brain that processes physical touch, is activating and bleeding into the visual narrative. The brain feels a sensation and maps it onto the closest available avatar in the dream space. It's just sensory crosstalk.
That's an interesting point, though I would frame it differently when we consider the environment where all of this is taking place. If the characters are just avatars crashing into each other, what about the environment they're crashing in?
You mean the border crossing?
Yes. If it's just random memory circuits and a desperate film editor, why is the geography so deeply indicative of his internal cognitive schemas? The dreamer doesn't just walk over to the girl's house. He has to gruelingly smuggle himself across a border river into England.
Right.
In psychology, a cognitive schema is basically the fundamental blueprint of how we see ourselves in the world. The act of smuggling perfectly maps onto the defectiveness and shame schema.
Meaning he feels fundamentally unworthy.
Exactly. In his waking life, the dreamer feels he is essentially an illegal immigrant in her heart. He believes he is unworthy of passing through the main gates of a normal relationship, so he has to sneak in. Furthermore, the clinical notes on this case mention that this was experienced as a dream within a dream.
Which is a very common phenomenon, but go on.
Well, psychoanalytically, that dream within a dream mechanism is the mind systematically building firewalls. It is trying to isolate and deny the painful reality of her moving away or rejecting him. It's the psyche's way of wrapping the trauma in layers, saying, this rejection isn't real, it's just a dream.
The geography reveals the exact architecture of his suffering.
That's a compelling argument. But have you considered that sudden location shifts are simply hallmarks of the sleeping brain's inability to maintain spatial coherence? I mean, you are interpreting a bug as a feature.
A bug? How is smuggling across a border river just a bug?
Because in REM sleep, the brain's logical processing center, specifically the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, is largely deactivated. Let me translate that. The dorsolateral prefrontal cortex is basically the brain's fact-checker and continuity director.
Okay.
When it's asleep at the wheel, the brain simply cannot hold a stable background.
So the sudden shifts from a local neighborhood to England to a border river
Are just the biological reality of state instability. It's like a computer program that can't render a background fast enough, so it just drops in a random asset from the hard drive based on whatever semantic node fires next.
I see.
And the concept of a dream within a dream isn't some sophisticated psychological defense mechanism. It is usually just a subjective misinterpretation of waking up from one REM cycle and immediately falling into another. Or it's a failure of state boundary maintenance. The brain briefly dips into semi-consciousness and then gets pulled back under. It's a hardware limitation.
Look, I hear the hardware argument, but if it is merely random spatial failure and a render glitch, why is the geography perfectly aligned with the emotional trauma of the waking relationship?
Well,
No, think about it. Why is the girl always depicted in an unstable, distant position? She is constantly across a border or pretending to sleep, representing the dreamer's abandonment schema.
because the emotional tone dictates the semantic associations.
But the randomness you describe should produce truly absurd, emotionally disjointed landscapes. He should be crossing a river of pudding to talk to a giant calculator. Yet every single geographical shift in this narrative serves to reinforce the exact power dynamic of his waking life. She is distant, she is protected by borders, and he is grueling through an arduous journey just to be in her presence. The environment is the emotional reality made literal.
Hormones regarding this specific person. The neural pathways associated with distance, borders, and frustration have been heavily reinforced by his waking anxiety.
Right.
So when the brainstem fires randomly, the forebrain pulls from the most active, heavily weighted pathways. It's pulling from the top of the deck.
Well, let's follow that emotional thread to its conclusion then, because the destination of this grueling journey is perhaps the most debated part of the entire case study, the final scene on the cliff's edge.
Right, the sudden shift to laughter and intimacy.
Yes, here is where we must look at what psychoanalysts call the prospective facts of the dream. We've talked about the retrospective facts, how the dream is patching up past failures through wish fulfillment. But in psychoanalytic theory, a dream doesn't just compensate for the past. It can warn of the future.
A warning of what? Exactly.
The image of the girl sitting on the edge of a cliff is deeply symbolic. In Jungian terms, the cliff represents the razor's edge between sanity and madness. It is a stark, terrifying warning from the unconscious mind.
Oh, wow.
The dream is saying, look at what you are doing. You are making a grueling attempt to cross these borders illegally. And where does it get you? It gets you dangling over a precipice.
So you view the cliff as a red flag.
It is a massive red flag. It's a sign that this emotional dependency is turning into chronic self-harm. The psyche is waving this flag, warning of a future psychological breakdown if this obsession continues. And that laughter at the end, when they're sitting on the edge of the cliff laughing together,
Yeah.
that isn't genuine joy. That is the hysterical relief of someone dangling over the void, completely unmoored from reality.
I come at the cliff scene from an entirely physiological angle, and I have to push back hard here. Dreams cannot predict the future, and they certainly don't issue metaphorical warnings like a concerned therapist. The final scene on the cliff, where they are suddenly laughing and experiencing intimacy, is purely a physiological phenomenon.
How can you reduce such a dramatic tonal shift to pure physiology?
Because you have to look at what the endocrine system is doing over the course of a sleep cycle. Throughout this entire REM cycle, the brain's stress circuits, specifically the amygdala and the sympathetic nervous system, have been running hot.
Sure, they're active.
Very active. They've been processing the borders, the rejection, the punch. But they are like a car engine revving in neutral. Eventually, they run out of gas. They exhaust themselves.
So the sudden happiness is just exhaustion?
Precisely. As the sleep cycle nears its end and the brain prepares for waking, cortisol levels drop sharply to stabilize the mood. The emotional tone of the dream arbitrarily shifts from anxious and fraught to calm and resolved.
But why the specific visual of laughing on a cliff?
Well, the forebrain is still trying to make sense of the inputs. It suddenly experiences this huge wash of neurochemical calm. So the desperate film editor, we talked about earlier, scrambles to create a visual representation to match the sudden drop in cortisol. What represents calm and resolution with this girl? Sitting together, laughing.
Right.
It's a chemical stabilization process, nothing more. Interpreting it as a razor's edge warning gives the sleeping brain an intentionality it simply does not possess.
I see your point about the cortisol drop, but even if we strip away the intentionality, we cannot ignore the profound accuracy of the metaphor. The brain still chose a cliff. It didn't choose a comfortable living room.
That's true.
But let us look at where our two frameworks actually converge. Because despite our complete disagreement on exactly how this dream is manufactured, we must find common ground on what the dreamer's waking reality demands.
I think we can certainly agree that the waking situation is dire.
Exactly. There is one detail in the narrative that cuts through both the psychoanalytic symbolism and the neurochemical noise. It's the moment right before the tickling. When the dreamer finally reaches the girl after crossing the borders and fighting his friend, she is pretending to sleep.
Yes, that specific detail is fascinating. It might be the ultimate truth of the entire sequence, and perhaps the only piece of objective waking reality that has flawlessly imported itself into the dream state.
It's devastating when you think about it.
It is. She is pretending to sleep, meaning the object of desire is fully aware of the dreamer's presence. She's fully aware of his efforts, his struggle, his presence right next to her, and she is consciously choosing not to engage. It is deliberate, passive rejection.
Exactly. And this is where our two schools of thought align perfectly. Whether this narrative is a profoundly symbolic warning constructed by a master architect unconscious, or just the neural inflammation of a system burning out from extreme waking stress, the ultimate message is identical. The psyche is under crushing pressure.
The dreamer has constructed an elaborate fantasy where his persistence will pay off. He thinks that his smuggling of his own affection across her borders, his fighting off rivals, will eventually wake her up.
But the dream reveals the futility of it. She isn't actually asleep, she just doesn't want to look at him. The illusion of control is completely shattered in that single image.
And from a biological standpoint, the chronic activation of these stress pathways to pursue an unyielding target is entirely unsustainable. The organism is depleting its resources, trying to solve an unsolvable puzzle. He is trying to force an outcome in a system where he has zero agency.
Which is why every simulation ends in chaos.
Right. The brain is constantly running simulations of how to solve this problem of her rejection. And every single simulation the forebrain comes up with ends in either violence, like punching the friend, or a precarious drop, like the cliff. The waking reality is that he must accept defeat in this one-sided relationship. If he doesn't halt this illusion of control, the physiological stress will continue to manifest, degrading his cognitive and emotional baseline.
We are entirely aligned there. The dreamer must accept the failure of the ego in this specific pursuit to prevent further self-destruction. The forced interactions, the displacement of his desires through tickling, none of it changes the fact that her borders are closed. He has to stop crossing the river.
He has to cease struggling.
Exactly. So, to summarize my position in light of our incredibly engaging discussion today, I maintain that this dream acts as a highly complex psychological mirror. The unconscious is utilizing deep, ancient symbols, the Jungian shadow, the border, the precipice, to actively compensate for the waking ego's failures. And simultaneously, it is warning of a catastrophic future collapse if this path of chronic self-harm is not abandoned. The meaning is the mechanism.
And to summarize my perspective, the dream is undeniably fascinating and a wonderful narrative to dissect, but it is ultimately a meaningless attempt by a stressed forebrain to synthesize a story out of random neural static.
Right.
The profound emotional exhaustion of his waking life triggers these specific pathways, and the resulting bizarre geography and sudden emotional shifts are simply the hallmarks of a brain failing to maintain logic and spatial coherence while bathed in stress hormones. The mechanism is purely biological.
Well, while we remain fundamentally opposed on whether the human mind in sleep acts as a master architect or merely a confused, desperate storyteller, we both clearly see the severe toll that unrequited love takes on the human nervous system. It forces the mind to construct elaborate, painful landscapes just to process the simple, devastating reality of a closed door.
It is a heavy toll indeed.
It brings me to this final thought. Stepping into the world of the unconscious is remarkably like looking at a broken X-ray machine. It is murky, it is terrifying, and it's full of static. But if you look closely enough at that static, the shape of the wound always reveals itself. We encourage you to reflect on how you interpret the landscapes of your own nighttime narratives. To journey into the darkest layers of the mind, listen to our Deep Dive podcast.